Welcome to Fox Soul's Black Report on this second day of Black History Month. Today is February 2nd. It's a Wednesday. I'm Seth Lemon.
I'm Nielle.
I'm Romeo.
I'm Demi Lobo. And on today's report, the commander-in-chief orders thousands of troops to Eastern Europe as Pentagon officials outline the possibility of combat. Meanwhile, there is now a $500,000 reward for information in the death of Kendrick Johnson, the Georgia teen found dead inside of a gym mat. But who is putting up the money? That's the question. Then, former President George W. Bush is throwing his support behind Republican candidates, but only those who he believes have a spine.
Patriots coach Bill Belichick accidentally sent text to the wrong person. Now they're at the center of a racial discrimination lawsuit against the NFL. And could we be facing 6 more weeks of winter, or will spring start springing early? It's Groundhog Day, but did Punxsutawney Phil see a shadow?
Ooh, can't wait to talk about it all. And you know how we do it. We do it in our voice and in our truth. So, soulmates, if you're ready, let's go.
Welcome into the Black Report. The crisis in Eastern Europe is escalating rapidly. After meeting with Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, President Biden has signed off on ordering more troops, thousands of them from America, to that area. The Pentagon said it would deploy an additional 3,000 troops to Germany, Poland, and Romania. Defense officials said the troops would not be fighting in Ukraine and that they are simply there to ensure the robust defense of NATO allies. But this move is seen as another sign the U.S. is preparing for the possibility of Russia invading Ukraine, despite several rounds of diplomatic talks. Happening today, though, Press Secretary Jen Psaki walked back the White House's description of the threat as imminent, saying that it sent a wrong, unnecessarily alarming message to Ukrainian officials. The U.S. placed more than 8,500 soldiers on high alert amid a potential deployment last week. An estimated 130,000 Russian troops are believed to be positioned along the Ukrainian border. Now, Biden still wants to try diplomacy. He's been threatening economic sanctions against Russia, potentially cutting off their access to U.S. technology, those semiconductors that are so important for all the things that they make over there. That would cripple their economy over time, but it would not ward off a potential invasion in the coming weeks.
Absolutely. This is all about solidarity, and we understand solidarity, of course. It sounds lovely, but because of the way that Afghanistan went, this has a lot of people wondering what is going to happen. General Lloyd Austin, he's been very vocal online on Twitter, on his Twitter page, letting everyone know, hey, this is what we're doing and this is why we're doing it, which is great. But also U.S. NATO, they also tweeted that they are continuing to encourage Russia to take the path of de-escalation. So that does make some people feel better. But at the end of the day, if this does not go well, there are many Americans as well as Black American lives that will be affected by this.
Yeah, I totally agree. And at the end of the day, if you think about the pandemic, it's been happening for the last couple of years here in our country and across the world. You think about the politics within our country, how we're going back and forth. We're having so many issues. Now this, a lot on President Joe Biden's plate to deal with, and I'm hoping the decisions that he makes moving forward are the right ones for us.
God bless our troops.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So it is that time of year again. Congress is trying to avert another shutdown. They have until February 18th to come up with a continuing resolution to keep the federal government funded. Back in December, lawmakers passed a short-term resolution that ends a little over 2 weeks from right now. Democrats want to pass an appropriations measure with new funding levels that last until September 30th.
Vice President Harris is urging governors to protect voting rights in America. Harris spoke to the National Governors Association this week, where she made voting rights a key part of her remarks. Take a listen.
I believe that regardless of who we voted for in the last election, we all, as leaders of our nation, understand the importance of ensuring that all people who are eligible to vote have an ability and a meaningful ability to vote and access to the ballot.
President Biden was at the event with Harris, while Texas Governor Greg Abbott and Georgia Governor Brian Kemp missed the event. Now, if you know this, both governors are at the forefront of the voter suppression drive in their states.
Civil rights groups say they are not falling for what they call a Republican charade on voting rights. The NAACP and other groups say the GOP's focus on the Electoral Count Act doesn't protect the voting rights of millions of blacks and Latinos. Instead, they say the act limits the ability to throw out certified votes when a joint session of Congress meets to count them after a presidential election. Former President Trump, he tried to get the Vice President Pence at the time, to interfere with the certification of ballots. The impeached president recently tweeted that he still believes Pence had the authority to change the election's outcome. Meanwhile, Senate Republicans are working on a plan to revise the certification process so it cannot be tampered with. But voting rights activists say it doesn't address voter suppression methods that are being used in some states to stop blacks and Latinos from voting. It seems like there was a seriously concerted effort from the Oval Office to maintain power at any cost, by any means necessary.
You know what I thought was very interesting was Trump saying that Pence could have overturned, and it seemed like he was kind of rubbing it in our face, like, hey, he could, just letting you know, he could have, and he didn't. So, but that doesn't make it any better. So I believe that if something is not done right away, Trump is, if he is reelected, God help us all, reelected, he is going to try to take advantage of that small loophole that we don't really know what the role of the vice president can do with the Electoral Count Act.
Yeah, I agree. At the end of the day, if Donald Trump was just to walk away and leave our country altogether, I wonder how many Republicans would finally realize what they're doing and what they're standing for is wrong. When are they going to stand on their own 2 feet and fight back and push back? I know they're fearing it because it's base, but at some point, someone has to stand up and say what's happening on our side, the Republican side, is not right. All right, soulmates, Representative Ilhan Omar is running for re-election. The Minnesota Congresswoman who represents Minneapolis is currently in her second term. The Progressive Democrat is the first ever Somalia and Muslim American woman in Congress. A Somalian-born U.S. Army vet is hoping to replace her. GOP candidate Sukwi Abdurrahman is a military veteran and mother of 3.
George W. Bush is helping to re-elect Republicans who voted to impeach Donald Trump. The former president has given the maximum allowed contributions to Liz Cheney and Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski. Bush gave Cheney $5,800 and Murkowski $2,800. Cheney is the daughter of his former vice president, Dick Cheney. She is also the deputy chair of the January 6th committee investigating the insurrection. George W. Bush giving the maximum to people who tried to impeach Donald Trump. On your tongue, it sounds great, but at the end of the day, these are still Republicans, so I'm not sure how this positively or affects the black community or the Democrats.
I mean, we're constantly talking about how the Republican Party has changed, it's morphed over time, and how we wish that these legacy Republicans who seem to have held a different standard for the country would speak up and get involved and stop some of their more far-right leaning colleagues from, being as vocal as they are and changing the tone of conversation around Congress.
Who would ever think the day would come where people would say, I would prefer a George Bush over a Donald Trump? Because during that time when he was president, people just did not like him. Well, Democrats just did not like George Bush. But I said it yesterday, I do prefer the old Republican Party than the one we have today.
Agreed.
All right. The Biden administration is supporting permanent legal status for families that were separated at the U.S.-Mexico border during the Trump administration. Check this out. It's the first time the White House has agreed to this idea, and it comes a year after the administration set up a task force to reunite families. Officials say the task force has reunited about 130 of them so far. As many as 1,200 were ripped apart under that Trump directive. We know that it was under the guise of COVID-19 safety protocols, but as Americans, the country with Lady Liberty standing there telling me, send me, you're tired, you're poor, you're hungry, it was not in line with what our country's values are supposed to represent.
Yeah, I mean, being the land of the free, we welcome people, right? That's what we were about. And to see this happen, to see so many families separated, and a lot of them are still not back together again. How can you imagine just not being able to contact, or you lose your loved one, your son, your daughter, your mom, your uncle? Just imagine that, and not finding them in this country, knowing you were coming here because you were told, or you were lived once before, if you come here, things will be better. So it's such a hard thing to swallow, and I'm glad they're getting things in order.
And let's remember that some of those places were owned by privatized prisons, GEO and Core Civic. And so it just goes back to how it's a business. Those people weren't looked on as human beings. They were looked on as price tags on their head. And that's why we have to continue to address getting rid of privatized prisons in this country. All right, Boston is thinking about creating a commission to study reparations. The city council introduced the ordinance today to weigh how it can provide reparations for the town's role in slavery. The council will also study the harm African Americans have suffered in Boston throughout its history. The commission would have 2 years to come up with ways they can formally apologize to African Americans for the impact that slavery had on the community.
America's largest death row is being dismantled. California Governor Gavin Newsom put a stop to executions 3 years ago and is now moving all men condemned to death row to other prisons. It's been 16 years since California executed someone, and former Crips gang leader Stanley Tukey Williams was put to death in 2006. Newsom says ending up on death row has more to do with race and wealth than it does with guilt or innocence. The Golden State is one of the 28 that still have prison death rows. Ever since Governor Gavin Newsom won his re-election, I find myself more and more proud of him than ever before. I feel like he is trying to prove he is for the people as well as for black people. Saying loudly and proudly, Governor Gavin Newsom, that being on death row is in fact about race is a very big statement.
I will say I don't know if I agree with the Newsom praise as much, because he seems to do things that are or have good ideas, but then get caught up in his own mistakes. Like the other day, taking that picture with Magic Johnson with no mask on. Those are little errors just that you shouldn't be making as that top official. But I do know that the statistics show it is more expensive to keep people on death row trying to execute them than it is to just pay for life in prison. It costs much more to taxpayers over the long term.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, you think about it, well, we make about 14% of people in this country, black people do, but we had such a higher percentage of black men that were on death row than anyone else. So just think about that, not getting that chance, right?
Yeah. Examples of systemic racism.
Absolutely. All right, so means there's a $500,000 reward for information into the 2013 death of Kendrick Johnson. He's the black teen who was found inside a rolled-up wrestling mat. Sheriff Ashley Polk says he will pay the reward with his own money. Days ago, Johnson's death was ruled an accident. Now, his parents believe he was murdered, and his death is being covered up. When his body was exhumed for a second autopsy, doctors discovered his organs were missing, and his body had been stuffed with newspaper. I can't imagine your child ending up like that. There's so many unanswered questions to the situation. I applaud this man for what he's doing, for putting his money where his mouth is. They want to find out the truth. We're talking almost 10 years later. This family, these parents cannot rest until they get the truth, and they deserve exactly that.
Absolutely. You know, nothing about this case ever seemed right. Nothing felt right. None of the details, none of them added up. Nothing ever seemed like this could actually happen to someone. And so, Romeo, I'm absolutely with you that this family deserves to rest knowing the truth, not just to push it under, I won't say under a rug because that's a terrible analogy using this story, but they deserve to rest knowing what absolutely happened to their loved one.
Yeah, his mother and his family are still pushing for the federal case to be reopened so that the investigation can continue. But it's good to see that Georgia's leadership recognizes that this case still has so many questions that need to be answered. It's just unbelievable to think that the young man we saw walk into the gym on that camera never reappeared and was just found the next day rolled up. It doesn't pass the smell test, and $500,000 definitely kind of qualifies the importance of this moment.
The fact that his organs were missing, it dictates an investigation, and there's something not right. Like you said, Seth, it doesn't pass the smell test. His organs were missing. Where they at, and for them just to close this case, it just shows how the justice in this country, it's not equal when it comes to white and black.
Yeah, the destruction of his organs, it really seems like tampering with evidence potentially, because that could have helped investigators long term. All right, drug maker Johnson & Johnson has agreed to a substantial settlement and will pay a $500 million potentially to hundreds of Native American tribes. This tentative agreement, it's not an admission of any wrongdoing or liability by J&J, but more than 400 tribes say the opioid maker and distributors are responsible for the crisis their community has faced. Native Americans have been disproportionately affected by high levels of opioid addiction. And in a separate deal, Purdue Pharma struck an agreement with the Cherokee Nation for $75 million. As a part of this agreement, the drug companies will create programs that help those communities devastated by the drug. All of the nearly 600 federally recognized tribes are eligible to participate even if they didn't join this litigation.
A black Wyoming sheriff has fired a white sergeant who was accused of harassing a black colleague for years. Days after becoming the state's first black sheriff, Aaron Applehans fired Patrol Sergeant Christian Hanley. An investigation showed the sergeant berated Corporal Jamin Johnson for years, repeatedly calling him the N-word. Johnson has filed a federal discrimination lawsuit against Hanley. The former corporal says he quit in 2017 because of the abuse. Someone that wanted to, a job that you work very hard to get, and of course in most states you work very hard to get, and so I'm sure he didn't want to leave his position. So the fact that he left because of the abuse speaks volumes. And I remember when we broke this story, I know you guys will remember about him being the first black sheriff, and Wyoming has 1% black people, and so I was worried, what can he really do? But this being one of his first big moves shows that he's going to stand up for us in Wyoming, and I love that.
It's about time, right? This is why we need more people of color in these levels. I'm talking about from police to politics, all across the board, because how do we weed out the bad people if we can't get people like this in? I applaud him. It's going to be an uphill battle, believe that. Like you said, 1% in Wyoming of black people. That's an uphill battle for him, but I think he's prepared and he's ready for it, and I applaud him on doing what he's did.
Absolutely. All right, turning to black news that is happening overseas. The African nation of Guinea is in trouble. There are fears of a military-backed coup that has neighboring countries worried about their West African friends. Guinea's leaders say they recently successfully fought off rebels, but the situation in the region is pretty grim. Military generals have overthrown 5 countries' governments on the continent in the last year and a half. Diplomats from around the continent are calling for peace.